Letter 25. Breaking and Entering into the Past. To Muhsin Ilyas Subasha. Dear Lady Mary, like you, I enjoy visiting sites and discovering the cultural riches of Turkey. And I have taken many of the same excursions that you did. You traveled up the Bosphorus in a kayık and observed the waterfront wooden mansions, the gardens, forests, and mosques, stacked like a curio cabinet adorned by the most skillful hands. You visited the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne. You explored the streets of Pera, dressed in mufti, and you bargained in your newly polished Turkish with merchants in the Grand Bazaar. Your descriptions of those Bosphorus sites, the Topkapi Palace, Hagia Sophia, the Süleymaniye Mosque, the Hippodrome, and the Blue Mosque of Sultan Ahmet, read as sharply as in any modern tourist guidebook. You even visited a dervish lodge and related the ceremony of the whirling dervishes. It was the letter that you wrote from Edirne at the beginning of your stay that particularly caught my attention. You told about your visit to an Ottoman Han, a commercial warehouse, and spoke of your astonishment at the animal you saw inside it, the camel. This stag kind of animal, a great deal higher than a horse, and so swift that they far outrun the swiftest of horses. Ugly creatures, more clumsy as an ox. You provided a detailed description of the building and stated, I own I think these foundations a more reasonable piece of charity than the founding of convents. Those Han buildings, now minus those camels, have captured my attention as well, to the point that they have become an important part of my life over the past 30 years. Ever since I first gazed at the Gök Madrasa in Sivas on my initial trip to Turkey, I have continued on an almost obsessional treasure hunt for golden stones. I have traveled yearly to hunt them down, spending much time, effort, money, and energy in the process. I, too, adopted mufti dress to wear along the road and to set me apart from the casual tourist. Perhaps not as elaborate as yours, but one nonetheless composed with attention. A practical, rather than fashionable, outfit of sturdy shoes, ankle-length skirts, and long-sleeved shirts, with sunglasses and headscarves to protect against the beating sun and indiscreet glances. The outfit is accessorized by a sturdy shoulder bag, crammed with essential expedition gear, flashlight, tape measure, notebook, pens, pencils, camera batteries and lenses, the ubiquitous water bottle, guidebooks, papers, a few Yulkar biscuits, sketches, and old photos dug up from dusty books, etc. For you see, Lady Mary, the hunt for golden stones is a bit more complicated than a sweet kayık ride up the Bosphorus, as it entails enduring the blazing heat of the Anatolian plains, dust, dangerous roads, objectionable lodgings, and perplexing situations. Yet the call of those stones was always stronger than any inconvenience I endured, and the glow from them has illuminated my life in unexpected ways. However, it wasn't just any golden stones that I sought, but those of the monuments built during the Seljuk Empire. And it wasn't just any monuments, but the forefathers of that very building you saw in Edirne, the caravanserais of the vast Anatolian plains built on the roads radiating from the Seljuk capital of Konya. I have written to you previously about the eternal question of why Turkey, and for heaven's sake, why Turkey for every year for the past 30 years? I told you in that letter that I went there initially to quench an obsession to view a building that haunted me since I first glimpsed a slide of it during a class lecture. I have also tried to explain to you in many other letters why I keep returning each year. That hospitality, those TTs, the peaches, and the similarities with the people I grew up with. Yet, if truth be told, the obsession with that building in Sivas and its ilk was a driving force to return each year. Turkey may be filled with friendly Turks and beautiful scenery, but it was the magic of those stones that pulled me back each year as strongly as any magnet. To explain the pull of that magnet is often difficult, and at times I just shrug and say to others, as much as I do to myself, that it is just because it is, with no explanation possible. There are certitudes in life that you just do not question. How you take your coffee, why your heart beats faster when you approach your front door, or the one look it takes to know that you have found the love of your life. These things cannot be explained with scientific phenomena. They just are. And so it is with the appeal that the Seljuk era exerts over me. Actually, it is twofold, this fascination with the Seljuk era. The first aspect is the society and culture of the era, and the other is the art it produced. So who were these Seljuks and the empire they created? Like the Etruscans or Celts, they can often appear remote and unimportant in the great march of history. But to me, they represent a glorious moment of civilization. The Seljuk sultans led an exceptional period of politics, commerce, and art from their glittering capital of Konya. It was a very short but golden era, flourishing from the 11th to 13th centuries, and sandwiched in between the two world-altering events of the Crusades and the Mongol invasions. Yet in a mere 200 years of existence, from 1077 to 1307, they managed to exert an influential economic and cultural impact. Most importantly, the Seljuk period produced some glorious architecture and decorative arts. These Seljuks were the founders of the Turkey we know today. They were the last of the great waves of Turkoman tribes that had been slowly migrating westwards since about the 9th century from the area around Lake Baikal in Siberia, looking for fresh pastures, new homelands, and promising possibilities. They were a group that split westward from the Seljuk Turks, already settled in Iran, known as the Great or Eastern Seljuks. Leaving the region of Transoxiana, the area between the Aral Sea and the Caspian Sea, and Khorasan, the area of northwestern Iran, this branch of the Eastern Seljuks reached Anatolia in the early 11th century. Previously shamanists, the Seljuks slowly started to convert to Islam on their march westwards. Although they kept certain elements of their former culture, the Seljuks embraced Islam with fervor and became devout defenders of the faith. They gradually took control of almost all the cities of eastern and central Anatolia, and when they defeated the Byzantines at the key battle of Malazgirt in eastern Turkey in 1071, the floodgates of Anatolia were open to them. These people were builders in both stones and government. My own country, the United States, has done much of the same in its own 200 years. And thus I feel a kinship with the dynamic endeavors of these Seljuks. They were fighters and survivors. They battled Byzantium to create their empire. They had to fight off the Crusaders who stomped across their lands and pillaged their cities all throughout their existence. And finally, they had to confront the Mongols for their very survival, losing it all to them in the end. Yet despite all those upheavals over 200 years, they managed to create a culture that shone brighter than those of Byzantium, the Crusaders, and the Mongols put together. This bright civilization shone in many aspects. Look at those golden stones, and you too will see it. Look, too, in the cultural traces they left. The Seljuks were responsible for reviving the Muslim Caliphate, polishing its crown once again with prestige and respect. They encouraged religious life and developed a particular form of mysticism known as Sufism. They invigorated the scientific and literary realms as well, bringing a new breath of inspiration to the cultural life of Islam. Determined to carve a prominent place for themselves in the world order of the day, the Anatolian Seljuks re-energized the Islamic world due to their governance structures, keen sense of social justice, strong leadership style, religious traditions, entrepreneurial attitude toward trade and commerce, and their devotion to education. Above all, their tolerance towards multiculturalism was a significant component to the success of their society. They accepted the diversity of the other faiths that they found in the lands they conquered: Latins, Greeks, Armenians, Provençals, and Jews. This tolerance has proven to be an effective and enviable societal model for others to emulate, from the Ottomans to the Americans. Yet, in my eyes, the greatest cultural legacy of the Seljuks was the innovative building program they undertook. They erected monuments that were noteworthy by their size, variety, and craftsmanship. In architecture, the Seljuks were fast learners, absorbing lessons from all the design traditions they observed in the areas they crossed. In doing so, they created a building style as rich as the savory stews they cooked on the campaign campfires during their march westwards. They started with the rich stock of their Central Asian roots, then enriched the pot with the meaty lessons learned in their contact with Persian architecture, and seasoned it with the rich vocabulary of Abbasid and Arab monuments. They developed a sophisticated construction system of load-bearing vaults, and the 4 open vaulted halls around a central court plan they saw in the mosques of Iran strongly influenced everything they built, becoming the universal design plan of the Anatolian Seljuks for their khans, madrasas, centers of higher learning, palaces, and hospitals. To this style stew, they added a dash of their own particular spice mix of innovative decorative features, techniques, and building styles. These were not just pretty monuments to look at. The Seljuks understood that useful and practical buildings could directly foster the goals of the empire they wished to build. Smart they were, those Seljuk sultans of Konya. They realized that economic prosperity was the cornerstone for the society they wished to build, and that this depended on the free flow of commercial goods throughout the kingdom. They understood that by promoting trade and commerce, they would engender prosperity, which in turn could stimulate intellectual and artistic growth. To achieve this vision, they needed to support trade and incoming revenue by encouraging the transit of goods throughout their lands. So how were they to go about attracting merchants to bring their goods to Anatolia, and to leave with those produced on the plains packed in their bags? The sultans needed to foster a favorable terrain for trade, one that provided a safe and attractive area in which to do business. And so they rolled up their sleeves and came up with a commercial plan with the same determination they showed on the battlefield. One after the other, the Seljuk sultans of Anatolia set out to conquer the important coastal cities they needed to establish sea-to-sea, kingdom-wide trade routes: Antalya in 1207, Sinop in 1214, and finally Alanya in 1221. The next step in this vision was to repair the existing trade routes which had served merchants for generations. The sultans were sharp enough to understand that to make money, you had to spend money, and their hands-on approach to building their kingdom involved investing in the construction of a solid infrastructure of bridges and roads. The existing roads and bridges, having been neglected and fallen into disrepair during many years of constant warfare and earthquakes, were repaired, solidified, and new ones were built. The old east-west Assyrian, Persian, and Roman trade routes were dusted off, and new links were created between the north and south to connect the newly conquered ports of the Black and Mediterranean seas. The country was now open for business. The existing Silk Road, linking China to the Mediterranean, now fed up to Konya, and from there the long road led across to Kayseri. From there, the road split to lead either northward to Sivas or Erzurum, the Black Sea, or the Caucasus, and eventually northern Iran, or either southwards to Diyarbakir, Mesopotamia, and southern Iran. The last step in their concerted business plan was to create an infrastructure for the merchants themselves. All along the trade routes they established, they undertook the construction of over 200 merchant way stations, known as khans, or caravanserais. This network, built to serve the needs of the major cities of the empire, was largely responsible for the expansion of both domestic and international trade. These way stations were built at regular intervals along the most important trade routes. at a daily camel's pace distance apart, every 40 miles or so. Their architecture answered every need of the traveler: strong protecting walls, depot spaces for goods, guard rooms, stables, rooms for sleeping, kitchens, latrines, mosques, and vaults. These hans served as both trading posts and overnight inns. To use a modern comparison, hans were actually a combination of a truck stop, a motel, and a warehouse. As a truck stop, they offered a place to refuel, which in those days meant resting the animals, watering them, shodding them, and tending to any illnesses they may have picked up. It allowed the merchants the possibility of eating a cooked meal, taking a break from the road, and easing the loneliness of the journey through socialization with fellow travelers. As a motel, hans allowed the merchants to rest for the night in fairly reasonable and comfortable quarters. As a warehouse, hans gave them the opportunity to unload their gear in a safe environment, to store it, sort through it, repackage it if necessary, and prepare for the next arduous leg of the journey. The building of the hans, with their adjunct array of social services, represents one of the most liberal institutions created by the Seljuks. Hans were established as charitable foundations. Every traveler, whatever his nationality, religion, or social status, was entitled to 3 days free lodging with food, medical care, and other services, all at the expense of the state. The Sultan, other court members, or private wealthy individuals established foundations for their construction, ongoing operating expenses, and upkeep. These hans will long be remembered for this generosity of services and the non-commercial role they played, just as you noted in Edirne, Lady Mary. Merchants could meet with the other travelers in the han, forming commercial alliances and new friendships. Hans also served another important non-commercial feature. They helped to spread news and information throughout the empire. People from all areas and countries came together, shared situations they had experienced in a babel of languages, and told of news from their home regions. This news was then passed on to the local villages and towns. In this sense, hans served as an information hub, local news center, and a sort of oral public library. Anyone who travels on the long roads across Turkey today can see the descendants of these hans in the form of the elaborate roadside rest stops, tesislar, that provide services for truckers and travelers alike. Once the state coffers were filled with the money earned from the use of these hans, the Seljuk sultans turned to the construction of the other innovative architectural buildings for which they became famous: madrasas, universities, hospitals, and mosques. The Anatolian Seljuks built in stone to last, abandoning the use of brick that was the practice of their Iranian forebearers. They devised buildings adapted to the needs of the empire they wished to create, one of growth and dynamic energy. It was in the form, function, and character of their civil buildings that the Anatolian Seljuks showed their brightest talent, starting with the development of the madrasa, which became a focal point for the city. The madrasas applied the 4 design plan to construct a campus building able to provide spaces for classrooms, lodging for students, study halls, and annex services. Hospitals and medical centers used the same plan as well, with ever-present welcoming twin minarets framing the portal. These madrasas and hospitals are some of the most beautiful monuments to be seen in Turkey today, such as the Karate and Ince madrasas in Konya, the Hatun Madrasa in Kayseri, the Darush Shifa Medical School in Sivas, and the Gevher Hospice in Kayseri. All of this was extremely fascinating to me, for it seemed so practical, founded in good sense, and so vibrant at the same time. Since my university days, I have enjoyed studying the arts of Islam. Islamic art took things from many cultures, mixed them up, and put their own spin to create something unique, in many ways like the culture of the United States. I was also attracted to the otherness of Islamic art. and I wanted to go beyond the garden gate of the Western European canon and see how others think, believe, and build. I wanted to pursue a dialogue of artistic differences. Of all the eras of Islamic art, the Seljuks of Anatolia spoke to me the loudest. In addition, the 13th century was one of great development all over the world. Who can remain insensitive to this period, the era that witnessed the Crusades and Genghis Khan, Dante, Provençal troubadour poetry, the Magna Carta, and the high Gothic cathedrals in France? This was a remarkable time to be alive, and the Seljuks were in the midst of it all, participating in their own fashion to the greatness of the country. I was especially drawn to their spirit of tolerance for all the peoples that they found when they came to Anatolia. I was attracted to their hands-on industriousness and will to forge a new social identity that respected the people before them, but also one that put forth an agenda they wanted to create. I was especially impressed by their association of architecture with social improvement, and how they understood that art and architecture could and should help build not only an ideal, but ensure the well-being of its citizens. I wanted to get to know these people and their society better. Above all, I wanted to get to know their architecture better. Of all the buildings the Seljuks created, the Hans seemed to be the most innovative and pertinent. I was intrigued by this particular set of buildings that united such a utilitarian purpose with such a particular attention to beauty and detail. Vitruvius, the famed Roman architect and engineer, gives us a definition of architecture as firmness, commodity, and delight. And these Hans offer a perfect example of a very felicitous union of these three traits. Firmness, because they certainly stand up well. Commodity, because they served the purpose to encourage commerce. And delight, because such attention was paid to making them beautiful. And quite simply, Hans corresponded to my taste. Hans are big, powerful, rigorous, and gutsy. Traits I admire not only in architecture, but in people, food, literature, and arts. I decided then and there that I wanted to study them in detail. And so I have spent the past 30 years on the trail of the Seljuks, hunting up their monuments, learning about their history, reading their literature, absorbing their religious and scientific traditions. I have learned much about all of these, and have come to greatly admire the Seljuks for many unsuspected reasons. In addition to the entrepreneurial and dynamic attitude that they cultivated, I deem that they laid the basis for all the humanist values that inspired the Turkish culture to follow: tolerance, freedom, love, friendship, hospitality, multiculturalism, neighborliness, patriotism, and respect for others. At the same time they built their roads and Hans, they laid the foundation stones for the development of the cultural values of progress, education, economic advancement, long-term planning, expansion, intellectual pursuit, justice, and free speech. Their leaders bettered the lives of citizens by building schools, mosques, hospitals, and observatories. Their scientists and scholars stimulated evolution in medicine, chemistry, law, and astronomy. Their folk writers, poets, and mystics sung the ideals of love, intimacy, hospitality, and spirituality in their creations. Their hard-working farmers plowed to prosperity the black earth beneath them. Their merchants skillfully and honestly developed their markets. Their architects and artists built monuments whose beauty and details sung these ideals across the Anatolian plains for all to hear. All the architectural treasures that have come down to us today from this period became possible because these visionary sultans ordered buildings to stoke the commerce machine, which then fed the creation of other types of buildings designed to reflect their cultural aspirations. Somehow, all of this sounds very familiar to those observing or living in modern Turkey. The dynamic tigers of Turkey today are none other than the grandchildren of the Seljuks of Konya. I firmly believe that if the Seljuks had not done such a worthy job at this initial empire building, there would perhaps have been no Ottomans or no modern Republic of Turkey to follow. It is not for nothing that Ataturk returned to the geographical and idealistic core of the Seljuks to establish his capital at Ankara, and from there to radiate his vision for Turkey, and to reinstill a sense of pride in hard work, progress, and industries as the values of a successful society, values that we are seeing laid with renewed vigor in today's Turkey. Because so many Hans still stand, it was possible for me to study them and formulate certain generalizations about them, such as their plans, patronage, road networks, and their decoration. The librarian in me enjoyed studying, classifying, and comparing this distinctive and unified group. I set out on a systematic, concerted plan, region by region, to visit every year as many of these Hans as I could. I would plan the trips ahead of time with great care and attention, and would visit several Hans in a specific area on each trip. The adventures I had along the way were often as interesting and intriguing as the monuments themselves. To find a Han, there were often aggravating challenges: mismarked maps, non-existent roads, no signs, etc. But the most frustrating was the fact that few local Turks were able to help me when I asked them for directions. The combination of my poor Turkish, foreign accent, and differences in local dialects often made asking for directions a challenge. Another complication is that a Turk is reluctant to admit to you that he does not know what you are talking about, or that he doesn't know where it is. I have learned that Turks hold honor over truth, and sometimes have difficulty distinguishing between theory, the desire to be helpful, and practice. They will tell you that something exists, or is even just in the planning stages, just to make you happy. Taxi drivers do not always know where they are going either, but seldom admit it, often driving around in circles. They will also refuse to show you something they think you should not see, much like the waiters in restaurants who will not allow you to eat what you want if they do not think it is in your best interests. When the locals do know that old pile of rocks I am referring to, they scratch their head in disbelief when this foreign woman is asking directions to see it. Sometimes I envy you, Lady Mary, in that you always had a valet de place guiding you on your outings in Constantinople. Such was not my fortune. Yet I would not have given up these frustrations for all the kebabs of Kayseri. Being a pioneer may have led me on some complicated, roundabout trails to find a Han, but in doing so, I had the opportunity to spend time chatting with people and learning local lore that I would not have learned had I arrived directly in front of my destination. So my golden rule has become to be patient, not to rush, not to get upset that you cannot get the immediate answer to your questions, to accept that the answer given may be embroidered, and to use this moment to pursue some interesting interchange. Ask directions from 5 people and take the majority view. Say a prayer that after traveling 500 miles to a hot and arid place, lo and behold, eventually you should be able to find your Han. For in the end, a Turk will never say, "I don't know," and leave you stranded. That you can be assured of. A Turk will never say no to a request for information, and will spend a whole day with you trying to help you find your treasure, for a Turk is always an optimist. An example of this optimism was seen in my search for the Alta Napa Han. I had read in many texts that it existed, and I had seen old photos of it in dusty books. Yet it proved impossible to find it on the road outside of Konya, at the spot where it should have been located. I stopped my car to ask directions at a roadside tea garden, and a typical chaotic Alaturka scene ensued, with 6 Turks and 6 different semi-answers. First, I approached a 50-year-old Turk, thinking he would have some knowledgeable idea about the area in which he lived. He paused for a moment and replied, "Well, yes, I have heard of it. Yes, well, let's think. Well, that's right, there is a Han around here somewhere." He did not seem to know, but in a typical positive Turkish fashion, he did not wish to appear unhelpful, and continued to talk around an answer as politely as possible. A second Turk showed up, entered into the conversation, and piped up, "I think I can help. I am sure my friends will know." He grabbed me and took me around to a charming setup of picnic tables overlooking the lake created by the Altanapa Dam. Sitting there were 3 Turks, enjoying the view over the water, smoking cigarettes and drinking tea. The third Turk put down his tea and pointed across the lake. "See that grove of poplar trees over there? Well, it is behind them. You can find a road that will go over there." His friend, the fourth Turk, interjected, "Oh no, Abi, it's not there at all. That Han has completely fallen down and no longer exists." The tone started to rise. In piped up the fifth Turk, "Oh, my brothers, you have got it all wrong. It is lying at the bottom of the lake." A heated discussion, with much hand-waving, yelling, pushing, and poking ensued, with another round of tea ordered to bring counsel. The sixth Turk, who appeared to be the umpire in the situation, concluded the discussion by saying, "Well, wherever it is, I'm sure it is just fine. Now don't you worry about it, my lady visitor. You will find lots more old Hans in this area if you want to see one. And after all, what was so special about that particular one? I'll help you find one you will like just as well." In reality, the fifth Turk had it right. One of the tragic victims of Turkey's vigorous dam construction projects was the Altanapa Han, which was flooded over when the dam was built in 1967. Another time, I had difficulty locating the Kırkgöz Han, located near Antalya. A similar scenario as the Altanapa show ensued when I stopped to ask directions. 5 Turks came running over and started to argue among themselves, each one offering 2 opinions. The discussion among themselves got so heated that I began to fear the results. And sure enough, before I knew it, they got so worked up that they started pushing and shoving each other. Fearing a fistfight, I started to pull away, but one chivalrous knight would not leave me in the lurch. Even though his buddies didn't believe him, insulted him, and even punched him, he persisted and told me exactly how to get there, giving me very vivid landmarks to look for along the way. His unusual clarity inspired confidence in me, and off I went from landmark to landmark, military police station, tree with 3 branches, house with the green door. And sure enough, he was right. Only a Turk would take such pains to help a stranger to the point of risking a black eye. As I mentioned previously, I learned after much experience that people are not always aware of the historical riches in their midst, or even in their neighborhoods. That glorious historical piece of architecture you have traveled 5,000 miles to see is often only an old pile of rocks to them. Locals would try so hard to understand my request, but many times they would just shake their heads and say they did not know what in the world I was talking about. I did learn a valuable trick, however, that has served me well. Come well armed with photos or sketches if you can. I once planned a trip to Iradir to visit the Galandos Han, which I had read was located 30 miles north of the town. I approached the municipal taxi stand next to the bus station and approached the 15 or so taxi drivers who were sitting on a low wall, passing the time drinking tea, playing backgammon, reading newspapers, chatting, jiggling prayer beads, and smoking. I decided to pin my hopes on one fellow, knowing that, in any case, all 15 of them would soon join in on the transaction. I asked if he knew the Han, and if he would take me there. I could tell instantly that he did not know, but, in typical fashion, he would not betray the fact. A major conferral session ensued, with all 15 drivers giving their opinion, not one of them aware of the location of the Han. The tone rose, they started to wave hands about and argue, and I feared yet another fistfight. To calm things down, I pulled out a photocopied picture of it from an old book and showed it to them. Bingo! He indeed recognized the pile of rocks, even though he had no idea what it was. Off we went, and he had no problem locating it. And I took immense pleasure that afternoon in explaining to him the history of the building and why it was more than just a pile of rocks. I am sure he went back and told the other 15 drivers, who in turn returned home to tell their families. Since then, I have found that a photograph, when I have one, is a valuable finding tool when in the field. After the thrill of the Han hunt was over, I was never disappointed by what followed. The emotion was always the same when I stood in front of a Han. I would gaze at it like a star-struck teenager in front of a movie star. Like snowflakes and cats, each Han is different. The stones were always of a varying hue. The portal decoration was more or less elaborate. The setting either arid or wooded. The location in the middle of a field or beside the road. I always like to stand in front of them for a long time, to absorb all these differences, to sense the history of each of them, to imagine the energy that went into their creation 800 years before. I want to memorize their face and personality, and to make friends with the Han before respectfully entering. Yet entering these Hans often proved problematic, presenting me the second trial on my pilgrimage journeys. The possibility of visiting the interiors of Hans was never a given proposition, and the challenge of gaining entry was always an adventure in itself. It was always a disappointment and frustration to have spent much money to get to Turkey, so much effort to trek out to the Anatolian plains, and then much energy to find a Han, only to find a huge iron chain and padlock on the door. But remember, this is Turkey. Nothing is impossible here. Everything can be accomplished with a little help from friends who will do anything to satisfy your request in any way they can. And the country of Turkey is full of friends, especially for a woman who wants to enter a Han. When I arrived in front of the Duragan Han, my heart sank, as once again the door was shut tight with the dreaded padlock and chain. As if possessed with ultrasonic ears that could hear my sigh, a vegetable merchant from across the street came running over before I knew it, and told me to stay put. He ran, not walked, down the street and grabbed a municipal street sweeper who had a bunch of keys on a chain. The poor fellow could not understand why the shopkeeper was pulling him by the arm, yanking the straw broom out of his hands and dragging him back up the street. The vegetable man argued and argued with him, and finally the poor, confused soul gave in, pulled the key off his chain, and opened the door for me to step into this Han, which had been completely restored as a shopping center. None of the stalls were rented, however, and the place was totally empty. Afterwards, I realized that the greengrocer was not being unkind or had not meant any disrespect to the street cleaner. He knew instinctively that the man, even in his modest state, would feel important to have helped someone from so far away, and that I would give him a tip to thank him for his time and effort. And so in this way, he accomplished a 2 for the price of 1 act of charity for both of us. And I got to see my Han. Another time, I arrived at Incesu to visit the Kara Mustafa Pasha complex, and notably its vast Ottoman Han. As usual, the Han was locked up tight, and my heart sank. A Turk who saw me standing on my tiptoes, trying to look into the high windows, came over and told me to come with him. When we got to a far corner of the outer wall of the Han, he asked me to wait there, and then disappeared. Before long, one of the stones on the wall started to wiggle, and then fell inwards. A hand reached out and pulled me through a small hole so that I could gain access to the interior of the Han. As I squirmed out into the vast courtyard, there was the man, grinning from ear to ear and bursting with pride at his exploit. However, there have been other countless times when I met with a chained and padlocked Han located in a totally deserted area, and no Turkish magic hands to mysteriously appear to pull me through secret passages. In this case, my good old Yankee just-do-it attitude clicked in emboldening me in ways I would never dream possible at home. I have squeezed my rather large frame through doors ajar, or have hoisted myself up over walls by grasping chinks to secure footholds, to climb up and plop myself over into the courtyard like a cat burglar. If the wall was too high, I have piled up rocks to create a ladder to give me a boost over the top of a wall. I have run and taken leaps from piles of dirt like an Olympic pole jumper. Squeezing in through tight door spaces and scaling over walls has been worth all the resulting scraped knuckles, broken nails, bleeding hands, bruises, twisted ankles, and bloodied knees. I will never forget the emotion of my first visit to the Pazar Han, where I dared to force the door open and crawl inside, despite the angry squawking of a gaggle of geese standing guard outside. As I made my way through the wild underbrush and overgrown grass and listened to the fluttering pigeon wings in the arcades, I was able to look past the tumble of rubble and fallen stones to see something else. I discovered a Han laid out in a perfectly powerful plan, with exquisite decorative elements of fine craftsmanship. More than that, I sensed the evocation of the space. I felt the message of history talking to me, and I knew from that moment on that I had to make the story of this Han, as well as that of so many others, come to life. Although I have been extremely creative and very athletic in my approach to visiting the interiors of Hans, I have never officially broken a lock or a door to gain entrance. No, for breaking and entering, I could count on the Turks to lead the way. Yes, once again, I have seen in this way how Turks will stop at nothing to help you out, to render service, to make sure you get your interests satisfied, and this often in rather dramatic ways. As you may recall, Lady Mary, I told you about that colorful visit to Siirt in eastern Turkey, where I survived the attack of the rowdy mob of street urchins. After escaping them, I persisted in my desire to visit the Ulu, great mosque of the city, one of the oldest in Turkey, built in 1129. Like a guardian angel sent from on high, a man came out of a neighboring house and took me under his wing. Alas, the mosque was shut tight with chain and padlock, and he shook his head in regret. A few seconds later, the grimy face of one of those street urchins, still tagging behind me, peered up at me. As if to ask forgiveness for the unfortunate incident with his buddies, he said he would help me. This little rogue proceeded to pull out of his pocket a very long piece of metal that looked like a broken knife blade, and started to jiggle the latch and pick the lock with it with the experience of a seasoned burglar. Before you could count to 10, he had sprung the lock and proudly opened the door for me to enter, offering me the guilty pleasure of contemplating the interior of this impressive mosque. Both guardian angel and rogue came with me inside, partners in crime at the service of a visitor and of art history. Nothing quite prepared me for a few of the other dramatic, unorthodox entries I have had along the way. One of the oddest was at the Zazadin Han outside of Konya. The Han is in a fairly deserted area in the midst of sown fields. As I approached the Han and saw cows grazing in front of it, I flashbacked to the scene when I first gazed upon those golden stones of the Guk Madrasa in Sivas 10 years prior. I walked across a deserted field of rubble and thistles to reach the impressive main portal. Of course it was padlocked. My heart sank as heavy as that cursed lock. How unfair to be frustrated after such a hot trek across that prickly field, which had torn my hem and bloodied my ankles. Except for those cows and the buzzing flies around my head, there was no sign of life or hope of helping hands. The walls of the Han were extremely high. so I knew I would not be able to achieve one of my Mount Everest rappelling expeditions. Frustrated, but still determined to get the best out of the visit that I could, I resigned myself to walking around the perimeter of this vast han to observe its fine outer walls, which were decorated with numerous carved stones, reused from Byzantine churches. As I stood there sketching the design of one of these recycled blocks, I sensed the presence of someone by my side. Silently, and seemingly out of nowhere, had appeared next to me a strange-looking, dark-haired man with wild eyes, dressed in grimy khaki fatigues, combat boots, and carrying a long black 12-gauge hunting rifle. I took a deep breath and wondered how I was going to extricate myself from this situation with my life intact. He stared at me, glanced over at my notebook, and started to speak, his ebony eyes flashing in the bright sun. Although I had a bit of trouble deciphering his garbled speech, I came to understand that he was a nomad living off the land, and that he had come here to shoot birds. As he explained it, the han was full of many kinds of plump game birds that he could easily bag. "Come, I will show you," he stated, and though I was still more than uneasy about it, I followed him. Would I ever have followed an incoherent, wild-eyed homeless man with a shotgun in a deserted field in America? Not on your life. But this was Turkey, and somehow I trusted that this was not going to end tragically. We came around again to the front of the han, and without a moment's hesitation, he lifted his shotgun and took aim. After a flash of light and a roar, the padlock was history. Swinging by its singed metal bits on the frame of the door, it was no longer an impediment to my entry or to his bagging of dinner. And so, in this rather unconventional way, I gained entry to one of the largest and most impressive hans in Turkey, which was indeed filled with game birds. When my hunter started after them, I left and wondered if I would ever have such an eventful visit again. Of course, I should have known that I would have other unorthodox entries. A few years later, I pulled up in front of the Karate Han after a rather difficult time of locating it, and spending 2 hours stuck in the car in the middle of a flock of sheep on their way to market. Once again, there was an impressive flock of geese standing guard in front very high unscalable walls, and a chain and padlock that looked as if it should have been attached to the door of the Topkapi Palace rather than this empty han. Not again. Not another futile attempt to visit a han. I kicked the cursed door in frustration and tried to lift the chain to feel how much it weighed, as I don't think I had ever seen one so large. A little boy, no more than 5 years old, came up to me, stared at my frustrated face, and understood my unhappiness from the universal language of my sighs, scowl, and kicks. He ran away, and after a few minutes I heard in the distance a hearty yell of, "Hello, I am here to help you." I looked up to find a Turk running towards me, waving and smiling, with the little boy scurrying behind him to catch up. As he got closer, I saw that he was carrying an axe in his right hand. This was no small hatchet, but one that could fell a redwood. "You want to go inside, I take it? Don't worry, I am here to take care of you. Just leave to me." With the little wide-eyed boy standing next to him, he lifted his mighty axe and proceeded to take on the dragon in the form of the giant chain. Pleased to show off his masculinity in front of the damsel in distress, my chivalrous knight whacked away at the chain with impressive grunts. It took him no more than 4 whomping thuds to split one of the links of the chain, freeing the padlock. He pushed the large, creaking wooden door open with much effort, and then turned to me. With a smile on his face as wide as the entry passage itself, he gestured me to enter with a dramatic sweep of his arm, as if I were none other than Aladdin Cakubad himself. And for one small moment, I felt as if I were indeed the good Sultan. All this breaking and entering has been worth the danger, for the moments of pleasure at the discovery of these Hans has been priceless. Favorite moments include walking across the 13-arched bridge next to the Kasikupru Han, one of the longest in all of Turkey, listening to the gurgling water of the Kızılırmak River swirling below it, and the shrieks of the young boys bathing in its currents. I enjoyed spending an afternoon inside the Aziz Han near Apollyon, now used as a depot for farm produce. I sat among the giant mounds of onions stored there, dizzy from their heady odor, pitching in to help the village women who were sorting them into piles by size. They laughed and laughed at me when I hesitated, or perhaps about my funny accent or clothes. But laugh we did, and together we shared a moment of feminine solidarity, despite our differences. I remember going early one morning to visit the equestrian statue of Alaaddin Keykubat at the entry to the city of Alanya. As I stood in front of it, I reflected on the life of this sultan who captured the city for the Seljuks in 1221, and who was responsible for building so many of these Hans I seek. Out of nowhere appeared a municipal worker, who then disappeared into the base of the statue and turned on all the fountains of the surrounding garden in order to heighten my moment of historical recognition. It was once again an example of those wonderful, thoughtful gestures I told you about, Lady Mary. I lived a very impressive Han experience in Doğu Beyazıt, in the shadow of Mount Ararat, near the Iranian border. As I stood on the balcony of my hotel room, located across from the Sim-Ur truck stop at 7:30 one morning, I listened to the deafening rumble of international freight trucks idling for departure. I then watched them as they pulled out of the parking lot in a convoy, all 57 of them, one after the other, much as I imagine the merchants and their camels did as they departed each morning from the vast portals of the Seljuk Hans, ready to set out in all directions to deliver and trade their goods. The Seljuk roads of commerce are indeed still alive and well today. Everyone always asks me what is my favorite Han, and I cannot select one in particular, just like I cannot choose a favorite poem, painting, or friend. But I have some that I remember above others, mostly due to those colorful breaking and entry adventures, or for their setting, their architectural singularities, their historical evocation, or for personal reasons. I am in awe when I see the Sharaf Sahan perched like an eagle on its dramatic site over the Mediterranean Sea. I marvel at how well the massive towers of Karatehan reflect the power and severity of its patron, the Vizier Jalaluddin Karate. I admire the Air Zakara and the Sarahans for the shimmering caramel hue of their stones, and the Kayseri Sultan Han for the magical dragon snakes carved on its courtyard kiosk mosque. I am touched by the lonely isolation of the Kargahan and overwhelmed by the elaborate ensemble of the Kasipraku Han and that unforgettable bridge nearby. I am humbled by the immensity of the courtyard of the Kirkuz Han, and I am inspired by the evocative decoration on the portal of the Evdir Han. I am intrigued by the origin of the sparkling stones reused from Byzantine churches that punctuate the walls of the Obruk and Zazadin Hans. One thing is certain, in all of them, I can hear the voices of their creators echoing in the arcades. Alaaddin Keykubat, Karate, Maperi Hatun, and Ghayaseddin Keykubat. As you can see from the stories above, visiting those Hans taught me as much about the Turks as it did about Seljuk architecture. I saw that although no two Hans have the exact same plan, they are all either rectangular or square in shape, with or without a covered section to the rear of an open courtyard. I learned to appreciate how their tall and thick walls were built with finely hewn blocks of honey-colored local limestone. I passed through spectacular monumental entrance gates, decorated with some of the finest examples of Seljuk stone carving. I walked around their perimeter to see the massive, fortress-like towers of the outer walls. I stood in vast courtyards, surrounded by cells, and tried to imagine the cacophony of braying animals and the babble of languages of the merchants as they unloaded their goods. When I peered in their dark cells, I tried to imagine their use. Were they used as storage cells, baths, repair shops, or granaries? I imagined I felt the heat of their braziers and the flickering light from their candles dancing on the walls. When I entered the large covered halls beyond the courtyard, I could still detect the heady odor of the animals stabled here. I imagined hearing the call to prayer as I climbed upstairs, leading to rooftop platform mosques or the upper floor of a cube mosque in the middle of the courtyard. The total silence in most of these deserted Hans made it easier for me to imagine what must have been the noisy roar from the staff, merchants, and animals inside. Once back home in the reading rooms of libraries, I read everything I could on the Seljuks, their culture, and their architecture. I learned that leading export products for the Seljuks were refined sugar and alum, the most important mordant for dyeing wool. I learned that major trading originated in the cities of Konya, Sivas, and Kayseri. I learned about many items unloaded from the backs of camels coming from Egypt, China, Central Asia, Georgia, Syria, Iraq, and the Caucasus that were tethered at the end of the day in the courtyards of the great Anatolian Hans. Spices, arms, cotton, woolens, silks, musk and perfumes, glass, cobalt, gunpowder, porcelain, pearls, gems, pepper, gold and silver, pharmaceutical products, and furs. I learned what those caravans took back from Turkey with them to their countries: tin, alum, sugar, borax, lapis, leather, mohair, timber, apricots, olives, wheat, textiles, carpets, and salt, not to forget mail and official government documents that were also transported along these routes. All of this information was fascinating to me, and I enjoyed making notebooks of my sketches, photos, and research. I could revisit each of these Hans as often as I wished on their pages. And I was thrilled to have my own personal guidebook to the discovery of Seljuk art and architecture. Yet one day, I realized that this information should not be kept in piles of notebooks on my desk. The librarian in me felt the obligation to diffuse the information that I had collected and organized. And the amateur of Turkey that I am wanted to make this architecture better known to the world. I also saw that there was little available information on the topic of Seljuk Hans in the West, and I hoped to fill in that blank. And so, in 2000, at the start of the Internet explosion, I decided to share my notebooks with the world via this most democratic of venues. The overarching aim of my website was to educate people and to generate a greater appreciation of the art, history, and architecture of the Seljuk period. My objectives at the onset were simple. I wanted to create an information resource in English that would serve as an introduction to the Turkish Han, furnish a descriptive list of Hans currently standing, and provide resources for those who wish to study the architecture of Hans or even to visit them. I was unsure at that time if anyone would care about these Hans or would visit the website, but I decided to create it anyway. I designed it entirely on my own, and I will never forget the joy and sense of accomplishment as I uploaded it live for the first time. However, underlying these clearly stated public objectives, I had several fundamental personal objectives. I also wanted to convey this information to all potential user groups, not just specialists in the field or academics. I wanted this site to be a serious study, but transparent enough for the average, non-academic user to enjoy at his level. I chose the format of a catalogue raisonné, a detailed description of each Han, to do this, rather than long essays on the subject matter. Above all other motivations, I wanted to share my love and admiration of Turkey with the world. Much like these letters I am writing to you, Lady Mary, I wish to convey my sensitivity and affinity for the country of Turkey, its people, its landscape, its history, its art, its architecture, its hopes. As a person who has devoted her career to cross-cultural relations, I felt this website was a way for me to explain my interests and to further mutual understanding and respect. Along the way, my website, www.turkishhan.org, has offered me much happiness. Organizing the photos, writing the text, determining how I wanted to present the information, and designing the layout have all given me immense joy. It has also given me other delights, such as the impetus to continue my research and to speak to students and journalists about my work. The greatest reward, however, has been in observing the reaction of Turks to what I have to say about their architecture and history. When I tell Westerners that I am interested in this tiny slice of history, I spend much time explaining to them the particulars of the era and why I admire this civilization. Yet I find that I spend a lot of time explaining the same thing to Turks, who often are not aware of the richness of this time of their history. The Seljuk era has been completely overshadowed by the Ottoman period, the one of glory and fame for the Turks. The Seljuks are mostly reduced to a brief section in textbooks, and the farther one lives from the Konya-Sivas-Kayseri triangle, the more remote they seem. It has given me much satisfaction and reward over the years to share my enthusiasm of the period with the Turks. And the joy I see on their faces as they come to share my passion is more rewarding to me than feedback I have received in the West. I have been interviewed on Turkish television, and I also was fortunate enough to be the subject of a full-page article in a Turkish newspaper, complete with photos of me, Hans, and an interview about my work. This strange American lady, rebaptized Kadriya, proved to be of interest to the Turks. I started to receive letters from all corners of Turkey about this article, telling me how they enjoyed reading it and learning more about this era. It was in these letters that I learned that many Turks came to discover this period through my website. Turks told me how they were now planning to take their family vacation to visit the Hans. They sent me photos, books, poems, and invitations to visit them. It was a magnificent display of that Turkish kindness and respect I have often spoken about to you, Lady Mary. I have since visited some of the people that wrote to me, and friendships have been made on the basis of this mutual respect for history. I have seen how this simple website has done much to fill Turks with the pride in their heritage, and this warms my heart more than anything I could have imagined when I first set out to create it. I have also learned from the reactions to my website that the Seljuk decorative arts, although long overshadowed by Ottoman arts, have started to appreciate in value in the eyes of Turks. Seljuk art, like any art at the base of a culture, seeks to confirm or express in each artwork man's spirit, physical structure, and relation to society and nature, combined with attention to detail, advancing techniques, mastery, and elegance. So what does their art say about the Seljuks? It says they are confident, strong, in charge, solid, and turned to serving both society and God. Turks have not lost sight of the fact that these arts must be preserved in order to ensure an important sense of cultural independence. 2 new carpet museums have been created in Istanbul. The London Islamic Sales Room at Sotheby's are full of Turkish bitters, and the famed Pasha Baca Glassworks has come out with a spectacular collection of glass that imitates medieval models. All of this signifies a renewed interest and pride in their culture. I remember distinctly when I went to Turkey in 1978 and wished to buy a carpet. Unfortunately, my student budget would not allow me to buy the carpet of my dreams. So I lowered my sights to a AHBÂ saddlebag, one of those small universal bags that stored everything from salt to spoons. I kept asking my Turkish friend to help me find one, and he looked at me perplexed. He just could not understand what I was asking for, and both of us were getting more and more frustrated. Finally, I saw one in a back alley and showed him. He stared at me in disbelief and said, "A donkey bag? You want a donkey bag? Are you crazy? Whatever would you want to do with a rotten, dirty old bag full of fleas and horsehair?" Today, there would not be such a reaction to that request, for I believe that Turks have gained respect and pride in their heritage. Their crafts now allow them to connect to the past, something very important to them. As Turkey forges ahead at breakneck pace to a new future, this is one area that can provide a reference point to connect with their families and their ancestors as a whole. Along these lines, one of the unstated motivations of my website on Seljuk Hans was to sensitize people to historic preservation. From my first visit to a Han, I have witnessed a tremendous change in the way they are maintained and used. Gazing upon the carved zodiac stones of the facade of the Guk Madrasa in Sivas in 1978, I had to step around cows, peacefully munching grass in front of the madrasa. Now, it has become engulfed in modern construction. So it is for many Hans. It is important to make sure that the Hans currently standing are preserved for future generations. Not just for future generations of architects who will come to study them, but for the children of Turkey, who, by coming to visit them, will read the memoirs of their civilization. Ottoman era monuments have been opened as museums or skillfully renovated for adaptive reuse in the major tourist cities of Istanbul and Ankara. Ottoman madrasas have been skillfully turned into health clinics, libraries, or warehouses for businesses. The houses of entire Ottoman towns, such as Safranbolu, have been preserved. The monuments of the Seljuk period have received attention as well. The spectacular madrasas and mosques of Konya, Sivas, Alanya, Antalya, and Kayseri offer the interested student of Seljuk architecture much material for observation. Hans, too, form an architectural heritage worthy of the same consideration. When I first started to hunt Hans in the early 80s, only a few had been preserved and turned into museums by the Turkish government. Notably, the two spectacular Sultan Hans of Alaaddin Keykubat, one on the Aksaray-Konya Road and the other on the Kayseri-Sivas Road. Since that time, several other Hans have been opened as living museums by the Turkish government, notably the Azikara Han and the Sara Han. Next to these spectacular examples, others stand abandoned and falling into ruin. It is estimated that almost half of the Hans originally built have been lost, which is not surprising in this land trampled by crusaders and Mongol hordes and shaken by seismic horrors. Yet many Hans have not been destroyed by them, but by the hands of unthinking modern citizens. Many Hans were demolished for profit, with their stones being sold for building materials or as collectible antiques, a phenomenon common in Europe. Another tragic consequence was the disappearance of a Han due to the flooding of a dam, as was the case of that mysterious Altanapa Han on the Konya-Beyshehir Road. Happily, many Hans remain in good condition. Often, they have been adopted by the village in which they are located and serve as municipal storage or farm co-op buildings to store farm machinery, goats and sheep and crops, a use not unlike their original intent. Over the past 5 years, it has been the policy undertaken by the Turkish government to subcontract the restoration of a monument to an outside company or vendor who then runs it as a business once the restoration is completed. The Seljuk madrasas of Sahibiya, Avgunu, and Serajuddin and Kayseri have been turned into bookstores, and the Sivas Darushifa and the Kayseri Hatun Han have been turned into shopping centers and tea gardens. The same practice is now being applied to Hans, which are being modified to suit contemporary needs. The Duran Han is being used as a commercial shopping center. The Horozlu and Nida Sarans are now tourist restaurants. The Kesikopru Han is used by the local municipality for civic events and weddings. And the Sarahan is now a mixed-use cultural center for tourists. The Alarahan now offers numerous merchant stalls to sell artifacts and handicrafts to busloads of visiting tourists from Alanya. There are less usual reuse programs. The Kadunhan is a furniture store. The Sharaf Sahan has transformed into a discotheque, and the Turkan Han has been turned into a sports gymnasium. The construction ribbon was cut in 2011 to completely renovate the Zazadin Han by the municipality of Konya. It is odd for me to think that its front door, so dramatically blown open by my shotgun-toting friend, will now be open to all to enter. There are also projects, such as for the Hatun, Azin, and Hakim Hans, where the sites have been cleaned up and leased, but without firm projects determined. Turks are becoming more and more culturally aware in their daily lives of this need for historic preservation of their architectural monuments. Over the past few years, there has been an increasing production of high-quality books with elaborate photos and documentation. The Turks have, for many years, published ethnographic-style books on the various regions of Turkey, with black and white photos of local historic monuments, the fleet of fire and garbage trucks, local crops, and costumes. These books, complete with local dialect terms, folk sayings, and songs, are catalog raisonné snapshots of a proud community. They are becoming increasingly sophisticated and are now accompanied with CDs, DVDs, and interactive CD-ROMs containing photographs of professional quality. I have met 3 famous photographers in Konya, Ahmet Kush, Ibrahim Devarcha, and Feyzi Şimşek, who have set out on a mission to publish spectacular, high-quality photographs of all the cultural monuments of Konya and Turkey to ensure that there will be a record of their heritage. Turks are awakening to their cultural richness and are promoting awareness of it. It is commendable that an effort is being made by the Turkish government to preserve these Hans. It is unrealistic to expect that all buildings should remain frozen in time and retain their original profile and use. Life marches forth, and in historic preservation, one must encourage new life for a building. A building, like the civilization in which it sits, is an evolving, living organism. In this vein, it is encouraging to see that these Hans are being creatively adapted for use in the 21st century. By encouraging their use in a contemporary social function, it is certain that their preservation will be assured by bringing them into the life of a modern world. In May of this year, a joint wedding ceremony for 35 couples was held in the newly renovated Zazadin Han in Konya, as magnificent a start for the new life of this Han as it is for these lucky couples. Respect for cultural patrimony is an integral part of becoming a modern nation, and it is to be hoped that Turks will continue to be as compassionate for preservation as they are in the other aspects of their lives. So you see, Lady Mary, how Hans have enriched my life. Their study has taught me about architecture, brought me cultural awareness, provided me fanciful adventures, shone light on the Turks themselves, and has shown me the debt Turks owe to their Seljuk forebearers. And a significant debt it is. It is obvious to me that the leaders and citizens of Turkey today are using the same tactics as the Seljuk sultans to create their empire for the 21st century. The Seljuk strategies of globalization, international commerce, free trade on safe roads and ports, improvement of infrastructure, respect for civility and dialogue, and the creation of an atmosphere of tolerance and cultural development are being copied with success. The Seljuks established a sense of identity for the Turks and gave them the confidence to be generous with foreigners, to share their food, land, and culture freely. They created a confident people, proud of what they have and what they can do. It is not hard to see the traces of Seljuk spirit in the hard-working Turks of today. With their sleeves rolled up, they are tackling the building of a country with the same drive, gumption, and determination. How proud the Seljuk sultans would be to see how their kingdom is now woven with a web of concrete roads based on their trade routes. And yes, how proud they would be of those dams and the resulting economic prosperity they bring. Although the Seljuks lasted only some 200 years, the stones of their monuments and their cultural keystones laid the basis of the Turkey we know today, confidently capable of supporting the future that Turkey will build in the 21st century. Ars Longa, Kadria Branning.